Hello, everyone. Welcome to our book launch event for Vicki Mayk's new book, Growing Up on the Gridiron, Football, Friendship, and the Tragic Life of Owen Thomas. Thank you for joining us now of all days, with it being the official start of the football season. This event is part of a series of virtual programs produced and ran by us at Beacon Press. The next one will be this Wednesday, September 16th at 7 p.m. Eastern, with public health expert Rosemary Day and the Ella Baker Center's Executive Director, Zach Norris, to discuss COVID-19 and its outsized effect on communities of color. If you would like to see what else our authors are up to, I strongly suggest you check out the link in the chat, which will direct you to our virtual events landing page. Before we start, I'm just going to do some quick housekeeping. First, check out the indicated link in the chat to purchase Vicki's book. Also on offer is our book plates signed by Vicki. The link for how to get one of those is also in the chat. And then finally, please feel free to utilize the Q&A button and not the chat button on the bottom toolbar throughout the talk if you have any questions. If we have time, we'll get to those at the end of the talk. That's the end of housekeeping. With us tonight, we have the author of Growing Up on the Gridiron, Vicki Mayk. Vicki is an award-winning journalist, nonfiction writer, and communications professional whose 40-year career includes working as a reporter at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the Courier News in Bridgewater, New Jersey. Her work has also appeared in regional national publications, including Miss Magazine, Hippocampus Magazine, New York Times, and many others. Her new book, Growing Up on the Gridiron, explores the experience of one young man and the concerns about CTE that he helped illuminate. Through Owen's life and his passion for football, the reader meets the issue with newfound intimacy, grown starker by the reality of the sport's place in our culture and our lives. Joining Vicki tonight in conversation is reporter Keith Groller. Keith has covered sports at the Morning Call full-time since 1982. He's been inducted into 5 local Hall of Fames, won the Publisher's Excellence Award in 1999, and has won numerous community service awards. It's such a pleasure to have them both here tonight. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Vicki Mayk and Keith Groller.
Thank you, Travis. Thank you very much. It is such a great night for me and long anticipated, as all of my friends in the writing community know. We're going to start tonight with a short reading from the book, and then Keith and I are going to be in conversation about the book and about some issues that the book explores. Before I start my reading, I would just like to give a couple of quick thank yous. There's no way I can possibly thank everyone who assisted me, supported me, helped make this book possible, but I would like to send out a special thank you to the team at Beacon Press. I could not have a better publisher. They are a great team to work with. I want to thank my writing community in the Maslow Family Graduate Program in Creative Writing at Wilkes University. Always a lot of support from my writing community. I want to thank my friends and family, and perhaps most of all, I would like to thank the friends and family of Owen Thomas, because only because of their willingness to talk to me about Owen's life was I able to write this book, and I thank them so much. So just to tee up the short reading that I'm going to do for you tonight, the subject of my book, Owen Thomas, first ran onto a football field when he was 9 years old. He never stopped playing the game until he took his own life at the age of 21 at the end of his junior year at the University of Pennsylvania, where he was playing football for the Penn Quakers football team. After his death in 2010, he was found to be the youngest player at the time to have CTE, which is a traumatic brain injury that we now know can be caused by playing football. My book, Growing Up on the Gridiron, is about Owen, but it's also about the importance of football in the lives of young men. So I'm going to read 3 cuttings from a chapter called Football Boys. Many of the memories in this chapter are told from the perspective of one of Owen's friends on the Parkland High School football team, Mike Fay. There are also some other players from Parkland mentioned in the cuttings. So, and Parkland High School is near Allentown, Pennsylvania, if you're not familiar with the geography. The sun burns off the early morning haze, leaving a blanket of August heat hanging over the practice fields. The Parkland High School Trojans exit the locker room in a wave, trotting across the parking lots that separate the high school from the practice fields. Cleats clack on hot black macadam as they approach 3 descending green terraced fields bordering busy Cedar Crest Boulevard. Summer is short for high school football players. Less than 2 months separate the end of the school year in June from preseason practice in August. For the dedicated ones, there really is no break. The summer months are spent conditioning in the weight room to ensure being in the best possible shape when practice starts again. There's no room for much else. Working a summer job, maybe, or playing video games and hanging out with the guys. Those things come behind lifting, workouts, and eventually preseason practice. For players like Owen, it was a privilege to be part of the summertime ritual of off-season conditioning and drills in 90-degree heat. He and his friends had watched older brothers, friends, and neighbors play as Parkland Trojans. When it was their turn, they savored it all. It was never a question that football came first for Owen Thomas and the Parkland Trojans of 2005 and 2006. That's the way it is with football boys, Parkland cheerleader Jess Benner quips. Football boys, Jess explains, are bound by their love of the game and by their close relationships. Running together like a pack of sleek, fit young animals, they share inside jokes, play endless rounds of Call of Duty in basement rec rooms, and surreptitiously chew tobacco. Being a football boy was their identity, one that grew slowly, started when they played pee-wee ball. If you were the girlfriend of a football boy, you got used to sharing him with an entire team. Our girlfriends used to get mad at us for not spending more time with them, Mike Fay recalls. They'd say, "Didn't you just see them?" And we'd say, "Yeah, but that was yesterday." The world of the football boy was built around rituals and rites invisible to the rest of the world. One of them, learning to chew tobacco, was part of the initiation for those playing on the Parkland varsity team. Mike remembers Owen's older brother Morgan, a Parkland Hall of Fame player, tossing him the tin of chew one day in the locker room. "Faye, you want to be on the varsity line? You gotta try this." I put some in my mouth. Of course, I got really dizzy and I almost threw up. Eventually, Owen started chewing too and rapidly coined his own vocabulary to talk about the habit. The last remnants of tobacco in a tin, too small for a full pinch, became a taste bud tickler. In a maneuver he called the flip, Owen turned over the chaw in his mouth, reversing the side held against his teeth to extract the maximum amount of tobacco juice. Next to actually playing the game, good times in the weight room ranked high with the football boys. Located in the high school's athletic wing, it was a place for strenuous workouts and to bond with guys who are serious about football. The long, brightly lit room's cinder block walls are painted in the school colors of scarlet and silver gray. A huge head of a Trojan warrior is depicted in profile on one wall, the helmet topped with a bright red plume. Another mural shows the Trojan in a full body pose, brandishing a shield bearing the school district logo. Beside him, the years of Parkland's state championship teams are emblazoned on the wall. Mirrors reflect the bodies of athletes working out. A sound system spews an ear-splitting soundtrack of heavy metal music. The first chords of AC/DC's Thunderstruck filled the room. Owen, clad in his favorite Led Zeppelin shirt, leaped into the air off the black bench where he just finished lifting, his long red hair streaming like streaks of fire behind him. He and Mike stood next to each other, Owen strumming air guitar as he tossed his head back and forth. Mike followed suit. Around the room, other players paused between reps, grinning at their antics. Facing each other, they engaged in an air guitar standoff, faces contorted, heads jerking in time to the beat. When the next song launched, Led Zeppelin's Whole Lotta Love, more guys joined in. Pretty soon, half a dozen of the Trojans' toughest players were engaging in imaginary drumming and strumming invisible sixth strings. A pause in the music, and some of the guys who had been watching applauded and cheered. Owen grinned under his bright yellow bandana, catching his breath as Mike high-fived him. It was weightlifting, Owen Thomas style. The Parkland football boys' nostalgia for their time together extended beyond the moments on the field. The time shared off the field secured their bond and defined their friendships as the most important ones in their young lives. We look back now with such fondness, Mike says, As you get older, you realize that's gone, that little 3-year blurb. And you look back and you think, how could 3 years matter so much? Those 3 years are so important. On a rare night off, John Zaccaro, another Parkland linebacker, sat with Owen on the deck at the Thomas's house on Jonah Gold Road, facing a bank of pine trees that rimmed the yard, like sentinels watching the suburban neighborhood. Dusk fell, dropping its blanket of dark over the backyard, slowly at first, then more quickly as the sun lowered in the sky. The two young men enjoyed a moment of companionable silence, killing time before meeting up with the rest of the crew. Suddenly, the darkness was punctuated with a net of fireflies flashing like tiny Christmas lights across the pines, hundreds of them, sparkling against the trees from one end of the yard to the other. Damn, do you see that? Yeah. They slipped back into silence until John's cell phone rang and they set up to pick up the other guys. They moved from house to house. Sometimes it was at Owen's for endless hours playing video games. Other times they traveled to Chris Funk's barn on Gaskell Road for beer that tasted best because they were too young to be drinking it. Their favorite hideout was the Zaccaro's home in nearby Northampton. The boys would hang out in a shed and in a gazebo overlooking the woods. Often they built bonfires. There was always beer, and it was there that the group smoked marijuana for the first time, hurriedly extinguishing the joint when Mrs. Zaccaro came out to ask if they'd like some spaghetti. High school was a time, they say, of innocent awesomeness. It was a time to be football boys.
Vicki,
Yes, Pete.
Vicki, I am one of those football boys in the sense that 24 hours from now, I will be beginning my 39th season covering high school football in the Lehigh Valley. Normally, we'd be looking at week 3, but because of the coronavirus, we are getting our start a little bit later this year, but I will be at a game this time tomorrow night in the Lehigh Valley, where Owen Thomas grew up. It's been a big part of my life. It's been a big part of my life even before my professional career began. I did not miss a Friday night football game as a kid. My father played high school football. And we just grew up with the sport, and it was a big part of our life. My son played. But unlike me, you're not a sports writer. I'm beginning my 39th season. You're not a sports writer. So how did this come about where you got into this wonderful book, Growing Up with the Gridiron? It doesn't seem like it would be a natural fit for you the way it would be for me, but can you discuss that a little bit?
Well, I will say this, I am, and we've talked about this, Keith, I am a football fan. I grew up in Pittsburgh. And if you grew up in Pittsburgh, you're a Steelers fan by your birthright, for sure. So I do have an affinity for the game, and I'm still a Steelers fan, even though I've been living in Eagles country for a long time. But when people ask the question about how I came to write this book, the easy answer is what really drew me in was Owen Thomas, the young man who's this book is about. When he died in April 2010, I was invited to become part of one of those memorial pages that people set up on Facebook. They set up a page, R.I.P. Owen Thomas, and the way that everyone talked about him on that page, from his teammates at high school and at the University of Pennsylvania, former teachers, casual acquaintances. They told stories about him being a warrior on the field and just one of the kindest human beings off the field. I remember one girl from his high school said, when Owen walked into a room, he changed the energy in the room. So I wanted to answer the question, who was Owen Thomas and how did his life come to this tragic end when he's such a beloved guy? How did his life come to a tragic end? And then when it emerged that he had CTE, that just added another element to the story, which I had already been interested in writing about him even before we learned that.
Well, high school football, actually football at all levels, is a very unifying thing, and communities get behind their teams. Friday Night Lights is well known, and everybody in certain towns across this country, and certainly in Eastern Pennsylvania, where our Owen Thomas grew up, it's a big time thing. And yet we know about the dangers now. And so people are going to say when they see this book, is this really another book just kind of extolling all the negative, all the dangers of playing football in this era?
You know, and the short answer is no. The longer answer is, you know, this is a book about the love of football, and young men who played the game and still are playing the game in the era of increased awareness about the dangers of head injuries. You know, it's a book about why football matters so deeply to young men that they would continue to take risks in order to play the game. And most of all, I hope that it's a book that is going to make people realize that there's no easy answers to this whole issue about head injuries in football, because football is so important in our culture, down to the smallest communities and all the way up to the NFL.
Well, and I give you credit because I think this book is not a one-sided book. I think it's a very fair book, talking about the dangers and also talking about the value that high school football brings to young men like Owen Thomas. Was there anytime you do something like this, you're going to have some curveballs thrown your way. You're going to find out some things that you probably didn't realize. But what was like the biggest surprise that you uncovered while researching this book?
You know, it ended up that I worked on this book for almost a decade, for between 8 and 9 years. And so in the end, talking to Owen's friends for that long a period of time, something really surprising emerged for me, and that was the enduring love for football that his friends and teammates have. And I say that's a surprise because over those years, I would sit with these young men and young women who were Owen's friends, you know, 2 years after his death, 4 years after his death, 7 years after his death, and they would still start to cry when they spoke about him. They, you know, their friendship with him meant so much to them. One of his friends, a guy named Mark Quilling, who was quarterback at Parkland High School, he wore a T-shirt from one of the youth teams that they were on together under his tux on the day he got married. That's how, because he wanted, you know, to feel like Owen was with him on that day. You know, that's how deep these relationships ran. You know, these young men all know about the CTE research. They all know the role that head injury played in their friend's death, yet they all still really love the sport. Most of them, I won't say all, but most of them say they're willing to have their kids, their own sons, play the game. They do say not till they're older, because that's become one of the key things that people do know about the research about head injury, is the kids shouldn't start as young as Owen started playing, but they do say if their sons want to play when they're older, when they're in high school, that they would let them. And they say it's because football was so important to them and such a positive in their lives. And because of how strongly they felt about Owen's loss, that surprised me. That really surprised me.
Well, I could tell you, having covered a lot of reunions of championship teams, that no matter if it's 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, those guys, when they get back together, it's like they spent no time apart. It's amazing how they just rekindle those friendships and rekindle the kidding around and the camaraderie that they experienced as young men. You know, and some of these guys, I've covered some reunions where the guys are now 35, 40 years old, and it's amazing how they become kids again when they're with their friends. But you talk about the concept of Brotherhood of Football. It's a big, big part of your book. And can you just expand on that and tell me where that idea kind of came from?
Well, the idea really grew out of the fact that when young men who have played the game, and actually I'll go back and say even some of the adult men a lot older than Owen and his friends would be at this time, the coaches, for example, when they talk about their experience playing the game, it's not just the sport that they talk about. It's their relationships with the other men, other boys on the team, that the relationships are just as important, maybe more important than even playing the sport itself. And so that, got me on this idea of there being a brotherhood of football. And interestingly enough, there's a psychologist named Michael Reichert, and he has done a lot of research about things that are the formative experiences for young men when they're growing up. And he actually says that he calls being part of a brotherhood as being really important in the development of young men as they're growing up. And it may be a sports team like a football team. It may be being in Boy Scouts. It may be, just a group of guys that hang out together in a neighborhood and they're all really close, but this whole idea of a brotherhood being so important to young men is something that he's researched. I like to say it's sort of the ultimate, it's the ultimate way of saying I have your back, to say you're part of a brotherhood, you're part of this team. And so, I just found that is one of the most important things about the experience of playing football, is that they are part of this brotherhood of football. I think we all want to belong to something as human beings. We crave belonging to something. And football gives young men that chance to belong to something. And it's very powerful. It's very powerful for them.
Oh, you talk about the brotherhood, and again, one of those recurring themes is the idea of football being tied to that an individual's personal identity, and I do that too. When I see somebody, I say Parkland football 1992. I'll say Whitehall football. I can't even remember their names, but I will associate them immediately with the sport of football and a particular school. Sometimes these guys go on to play college but can you talk about this idea of personal identity, and are these guys aware of how much they're identified with their sport, with their school as they're playing the game, or is this something that kind of happens later on in life?
So let me just say this. I think there's a certain consciousness about it when they're playing the game. For example, when they're in high school, they'll definitely talk about how much they like being part of the team. And, the one cheerleader made that comment calling them football boys, definitely an awareness that, this identity is important to them while they're in high school, while they're playing the game as high school students. And they're also aware of what it means if they lose that identity at that age, which, your teenage years are really formative years. There's a story in the book about a young man who ends up having to drop off the team, and he really talks about how difficult it was to lose the identity of being part of the football team. He talks about that and remembers, kind of feeling kind of adrift when he was no longer able to be part of the football team in high school. So there's definitely awareness when they're in high school, Keith, but I will say this, I think it's like anything, as people get older, they're even more aware of how much this was part of their identity. I mentioned I followed a number of these young men, both players on University of Pennsylvania's team and from Owen's high school team at Parkland, talked to them regularly over a 10-year period. And as they got out of college and have, they started their lives, gotten married, have kids, they do have even more of a perspective about what the identity of having been a football player meant to them. I mentioned Mike Fay in that reading I did. Mike, in the book, he talks about how he was like kind of the awkward kid. And now he can see in retrospect, he was the awkward kid in middle school, as so many of us are, right? middle school, you're kind of the awkward kid. You think you're the only one and you find out everybody feels that way. But, you know, he saw that he was that awkward kid and that becoming a football player really helped, you know, form his personality, really helped him, you know, form an identity. One of the Penn players, Jake Peterson, who's on the West Coast, you know, he talks about when he decided at the end of college, he had a chance to possibly be a walk-on in the pros, and he had an injury and he had to give it up. And he realized, and also what happened to Owen kind of scared him as well. But he realized he had to develop a whole new identity for himself, because since he was like 6 or 7 years old, he was a football player. And so, you know, definitely a very significant thing. And I'll just close by saying, one morning recently, I was listening to a story on National Public Radio about the fact that, you know, the Big Ten, the Pac-12 canceled seasons, and the president of Rutgers University was being interviewed, and he specifically mentioned that this student athletes, this is a loss of identity for them not to be able to play their sport. And he actually used the word destabilizing to characterize what that's like. So very much part of people's identity.
Well, you cover it well in this book, and I can really attest to it because I've done so many interviews, Vicki, when the season has just ended. And sometimes they'll end with a victory in the state championship game, the crowning moment of a high school athlete's career. And there's tears streaming down the faces of some of these young men, even when they are victorious in that last game, Vicki. And I've asked them, I said, you know, you just won. You're a champion. Why are you upset? And it's because he knew that, yes, a certain amount of kids will go on to play college football. Very few will go on to play professional football. But for most of those kids at the high school level, Vicki, when it ends, it's over. And they're taking off a football uniform for that last time. And the emotions just pour out of them. And sometimes as a reporter, you just got to step back and let them express those emotions, because they're strong. And you talk about it, that the brotherhood concept, the identity concept, they're very strong in this particular sport.
They really are. In fact, Jim Morgan's, one of the coaches, mentions that fact that only about 7%. You think it's larger, but the last figure I saw, only about 7.5% of high school players go on to play in college. So that really is an ending of an identity for a lot of young men. Yes,
indeed, and for many of them, their football careers start well before they get to high school. That starts at the knee-high level when they, or flag football level when they're very young. I want to ask you about Dr. Ann McKee, the Boston University researcher who was studying CTE. She's an important part of this book. How did you approach writing about the scientific aspects of this story?
Well, in a word, I had to do my homework. There are a lot of great resources out there. The Concussion Legacy Foundation, which is dedicated to educating people about head injuries, has great resources on their website that really explains the whole issue of CTE in layman's terms. It explains in terms that any of us can understand, what happens, even from subconcussive hits, how that begins to form this protein that is what characterizes CTE, tau protein. But it's really a matter of doing your homework, going through all of these resources, really familiarizing yourself. There's, in my career, I actually at different times have had to write about, I've worked for colleges and universities, and I've had to write about different professors' research. And my goal has always been to have them explain it to me in a way that I can understand it, because I know if I can understand it, then I can write it in a way that anybody can understand. And that was really my goal in writing about the scientific and research aspects of this. I also went to see Dr. McKee in Boston twice in researching the book, and I visited the brain bank. It's an interesting fact that when I went into the brain bank that's behind the VA hospital in Jamaica Plain in Boston, it's this really nondescript building behind the hospital. And when I walked in, you know, researchers make posters about important cases. The first poster hanging in the hallway was the one about Owen Thomas's case, which was really, you know, pretty overwhelming to see, because at that point when I went there, I'd been working on the book for a number of years, but I went to the brain bank and they walked me through what they do when a brain comes into the facility there and how they examine it. So really a lot of plain and simple homework.
Well, you know, you and Dr. Key have something in common. You both grew up being football fans. You identified yourself as a Steeler fan. And of course, the Steelers, even though in the Lehigh Valley where I work, we're you know, a state away basically from Pittsburgh, but there's still a ton of Pittsburgh Steelers fans here. You quote Dr. McKee as saying she doesn't feel the same way about the game of football because of her research. Has writing this book, has it affected you, how you feel about the game that you loved and as a fan, and certainly I believe that you probably celebrated those Super Bowl championships has it impacted how Vicki Mayk looks at that sport now after doing all this work?
Well, you know, Keith, I have to say it's impossible to do a deep dive into a subject like CTE in football and not have it alter to some degree the way you feel about the game. And I have to say too, you know, mentioned that I was raised a Steelers fan. So, you know, Mike Webster, legendary Steelers player, Iron Mike, you know, he's pretty much acknowledged to be patient zero in the CTE research. You know, he was the one who, you know, they officially, when they examined his brain after he died, the researcher, a guy named Bennett Amalu, he gave the name chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, to what he saw in Mike Webster's brain. You know, reading about what happened to him after his career ended. You know, he was such a fierce player that he had a callus on his forehead from the way he led with his head, you know, and you know, on the line of scrimmage. So, you know, reading about the physical and mental toll that the sport took on him, you know, there's a really sad story. You know, you know, his memory was gone, his body was breaking down, and somebody ran into him once on the street somewhere and said, aren't you Mike Webster? And his answer was, I used to be. And just such a sad story. And, you know, in researching Owen's story, it wasn't, you know, as dramatic, but there was an unraveling. You know, Owen was really struggling with depression, which they do now know can be a byproduct of you know, brain injury, of traumatic brain injury. So, you know, here was a young man who was a warrior on the field and a top student and a really positive person. And in the end, there's this unraveling and he ends up taking his own life. So, and, you know, a lot of evidence that this could be linked to football. So that's a long answer to say, yes, it's affected the way I feel about the game. I have not watched a complete football game start to finish in at least 3 years. And although I'll have some people knowing I worked on this book will send me messages like when Mason Rudolph got knocked out last fall in that Steelers game, people were in touch with me right away saying, do you know what happened today? So I still check scores, but I don't quite have the passion I used to have.
That's interesting. That's very, very interesting. What do you think the future of the sport is going to be? Because it's still very popular. I think it's still the #1 viewed sport on TV. It was alluded to earlier. The NFL season kicks off tonight. Kansas City, Super Bowl champions are playing, and I'm sure the ratings, especially during this pandemic, will be off the charts because people have just waited and waited for the return of football and just something to create some normalcy. But what do you think about the future? Can we do this sport, which has been so popular for so long? Can we do it, in your opinion, safely?
There's always going to be an element of risk. you know, and frankly, a high level of risk. But, you know, the folks at the Concussion Legacy Foundation make a point. Chris Nowinski's the gentleman who started that organization, and he's really the one responsible for raising a lot of awareness about head injury in youth sports, not just football, but other youth sports, ice hockey, soccer. And that's this, that they make the point that when adults are playing the game, and Dr. McKee says this too, when adults are playing the game, that's an adult choice. You know, that's an adult choice. What the folks at Concussion Legacy Foundation are concentrating a lot of efforts on is not having kids play so young, because, you know, that's where they feel that they can affect some change and maybe, you know, protect some people a little bit better. You know, the research is definitely showing the earlier somebody plays and the longer they play, you know, the more danger there is. So, and also just the protocols that are being developed for taking people out when they've had a concussion, or even, you know, mild head injury. It's strange to characterize it as mild, because when you think of doing something to your brain, it's a little scary no matter what. But they've developed some protocols that I think are going to make it safer. And I think that they're going to be working on that all the time. I do think the numbers are going to go down a little bit in youth sports. They already have gone down. National Federation of High Schools keep records of participation rates. An 11-man high school football, at the end of the 2018-2019 school year, it was down 3% from the previous year, and it was at the lowest point since 1999. So I think you're going to see fewer young people playing the game, but I frankly don't see it going away.
Well, me neither. I have to agree with you, because it's still a cause of such great passion in this country, and it starts at the high school level, and then we see 110,000 people at Beaver Stadium on a Saturday afternoon, and on a Sunday afternoon we see stadiums across this nation put 75, 80,000 people. Now, it's more than just the game, Vicki. It's the whole party atmosphere. There's great tailgating going on. The sports bars depend on football. Certainly the TV people depend on. I don't see it going away. But I think you hit it on the head, and maybe you can expand upon it. I believe we are safer than we were, certainly, even when Owen Thomas was coming through Parkland High School. Improvements have been made. There's more awareness. There's more research. We've got to get that technology, I think, to the point that we can make it as safe as. We're never going to take all the risk out, but I think if we can get to that point where we can minimize the risk, make it as safe as it possibly can be, then it can continue to be one of the great sports in this country going forward. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, as I mentioned, just the changes in the protocols. You know, now you have a medical person on the sidelines. Most schools have somebody right on the sidelines now. I mean, they always did have someone, but now the purpose is to evaluate. You know, and there's a concerted effort to evaluate a player. If, you know, the classic, if they had their bell rung, that was the old saying for,
yep.
You know, having your head knocked around a little bit too much. You know, the player's taken out of the game now. That's the protocol. That's the rule. The same on the pros. If they have, you know, symptoms of a concussion, they're out for a specified period of time. You know, if you really read the stories of some of the pros in which this disease has been found, you know, multiple concussions sent right back into play after they've had them. So, you know, yes, I think that they're going to continue to try to improve the safety of the game. And again, you hit it on the head. It's a cultural phenomenon in the United States. People celebrate Super Bowl Sunday who don't watch games all year.
Right.
It's kind of beyond just being a game.
Well, one of the gentlemen you spoke to and is featured prominently in the book is Jim Morgans. And I believe at one time Jim was sort of a part-time trainer. And he's not really a medical man. I mean, he's a good football coach, but at one time he was taping ankles and kind of checking on spraying the ethyl chloride and the different stuff that they used. And just in my career, Vicki, I could speak to this. The medical profession, the medical people on the sideline at a football game, they are top notch. God bless Jim Morgan's and some of the old folks that used to do it, who were basically just doing it as a part-time job and just maybe they had some medical background, but they weren't really qualified. Now we got the best and brightest on those sidelines to try to check on those kids immediately to see, you know, do you have signs of a concussion? And they will in the old days, maybe the trainer would not be as demonstrative in telling the coach, hey, he can't go back in. Now they will be. Everybody's more aware, and coaches, most of all, are aware they can't put anybody at risk if there's any sign of a concussion or a major injury. But what do you hope ultimately people take from this great book that talks about pluses and ultimate tragedy coming out of the game of football, Vicki?
You know, I thought heading into this evening, I was thinking about this, and I saw online that today is World Suicide Prevention Day. Every year there is a World Suicide Prevention Day, and it happens to be today. So among other things, overall, I hope that the book will raise awareness about a number of things. I hope that it'll raise awareness about suicide and how folks should intervene if they're concerned that somebody they really care about might be at risk for suicide or for suicidal behavior. That's one thing. And then about head injuries, you know, awareness on the part of fans of the risks that the players that they love are taking, you know, in order to give them that thrill of playing the game. If you're a parent, being educated about the risks for your sons and maybe not starting them playing the game too young, and, you know, players being more aware so that they play more intelligently and don't take as many risks themselves, and that they self-report if they've been injured, because there was traditionally a lot of that as well. Players didn't want to be taken out of a game. So just awareness for people on all those levels and about all those issues is what I really hope the most.
Well, I tell you what, Vicki, I think you've scored a touchdown with this book. I think it's a fascinating look at a young man and really goes beyond the field to what football meant in his life, what it has meant to so many of his friends. And I commend you. I think it's a very fair book, whether you're pro football, whether you're a football fan who wants it to continue, or whether you're really, really concerned and maybe you're going to hold back your son or grandson from playing the game. I think you put a lot of great research into it, and I think it's going to be a big, big winner. And I encourage the Lehigh Valley fans and really any football fan in any part of the country, really. Certainly it's big time here in Pennsylvania, but I wish you well with this book. And I know we have a lot of people that want to ask you questions. So I would just want to thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. And again, I really encourage everybody to get out there and support, buy this book and learn about Owen Thomas, but learn about football, the good, the bad, the ugly. And I commend you highly, Vicki.
Thanks, Keith. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Keith. Thanks, Vicki. Yeah, that was an amazing conversation. Okay, so yeah, we have a ton of questions. Let's get started. Okay, so Joy asks, how did you merge the nuts and bolts of interviews with the narrative of the story? Was it difficult to blend the two? Did you have an idea of where the story would go when you first started the interviews? Also, a wonderful job.
So actually, because I interviewed for such a long time, I didn't, at the beginning, I did not have an idea of where it would go. You know, I was on a research expedition. As I said, I wanted to find out who this young man was, Owen Thomas. But as time went on, you know, certain themes and certain things started to emerge. So it was only after I'd been interviewing for several years that I really started to find, you know, what the threads were that were going to carry things through. The hardest thing wasn't deciding what to do with the interviews. The hardest thing was balancing the story part with the research part. I will candidly say that was the most challenging.
All right, let's see. Danielle asks, how did you approach the process of researching and writing a book-length work of nonfiction as opposed to the shorter form journalism you did at other points in your career?
Well, it was like nothing else I'd ever done. You've hit the nail on the head. You know, it really was a case of, you know, I had read there are people I admired who have done this kind of a longitudinal look at a subject. Dave Cullen, who wrote the book Columbine, which is kind of like a landmark book about that school shooting that was really a landmark event. You know, I looked at people like him and how they approach things. And, you know, I did so much interviewing that one of the challenges at first that was very different than the shorter form journalism I had done before, one of the challenges was realizing I couldn't possibly use all the interviews I had and everyone I had. And I mentioned having looked at a person like Dave Cullen because I watched an interview with him where he said he looked at all of the people around that event that he had interviewed, and he chose to focus on specific people because of something important that they had to say related to that event, or they represented a number of people's perspectives, so they were sort of emblematic of that perspective. So I really had to find a way to organize a lot more material, and I would say that is one of the most significant differences between you know, being a reporter for daily newspapers and writing, you know, this kind of a full-length work of literary journalism. So
Dawn asks, I have purchased the book and it is what I will be reading next. Have any of the members of Owen's family read it, and have they commented?
His brother Morgan has read it, and I've had a very kind email from Morgan thanking me for the book. Owen's mom has said she's not sure how soon she'll read it. You know, I don't know. So I know some folks may have read the book already. This spoiler alert, you know, Owen's father died toward the end of the time I was working on the book. So Owen's mom has really, who's a very impressive woman. You know, she testified in front of Congress about head injuries, for example, within the first year after Owen died. She's a very strong lady, but she's had a lot going on. So she told me she doesn't know how quickly she'll get to reading the book. So I have heard from Morgan, Owen's brother, and I've also heard from a number of his friends.
All right, so the next two we can probably kind of combine. Catherine asks, or first says, great reading, and then says, how did writing this book change you? And then Rachel asks, what did you enjoy the most about this writing experience?
How did it change me? Well, it made me realize that it gave me confidence in being able to handle a work of this scope and a work of this size. And now that I've done it, I actually am excited at the prospect of doing it again on another subject at some point. So that's how it changed me. Can you repeat the second question, please?
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's Rachel asks, what did you enjoy the most about this writing experience?
Truthfully, I enjoyed the interviewing the most. I enjoyed going out and meeting all of these folks and talking with them. In fact, one of my mentors joked that perhaps I would just research forever and never start writing the book, because that is something that can happen. You can sort of fall in love with research and interviewing. You know, writing's kind of a lonely occupation, and interviewing, you know, is by its very nature interactive. So I did really enjoy that interactive aspect quite a bit.
Laurie asks, could you speak about the pressure these young players experience as football being their primary path to college and the necessity of getting an athletic scholarship?
You know, I have to say that most of Owen's high school friends, with one or two exceptions, did not go to Division I schools, and scholarships are not part of the experience. Division II and Division III, NCAA rules prohibit scholarships at those levels of play. But I think it's very well documented that, especially, one of the concerns about the sport moving forward is that young men from lower socioeconomic groups, it's been fairly well documented that many times they see the ability to get an athletic scholarship as a way to continue education. And there, from the research that I've done, there is an increasing concern that more and more the game on the higher levels, on the college level, and even in the pros, is going to be made up of people, not completely, of course, but increasingly people from lower socioeconomic groups who see getting the scholarship to play football, to play other sports, as a way to be able to go to college. And that's something that's talked, it's not something that I deal with a lot, because the group of players that I was interviewing, that was not the reality for most of them. But it is definitely an issue that has been written about a lot and widely acknowledged to be an issue. And the one thing I will say, repeating, is that with the greater concern about head injuries, there is a lot of concern that people who see this as the only way may be the ones who continue to be the ones to play a sport that's pretty dangerous.
Pamela asks, I learned in the book that Owen's mom testified before a congressional committee investigating brain injuries in football. Can you share what she said to the committee and what she recommended?
She said that a couple of things, that they had no idea that there was any problem whatsoever, that he had never had a diagnosed concussion, that they had never seen any indication that he had post-concussion syndrome. She acknowledged that he was the kind of player who probably would have continued to play, even if he had had, quote, his bell rung or saw stars, or whatever euphemism you want to use for really taking a solid hit to the head. She acknowledged that he was the kind of player who would have continued to play. So even though he didn't have any diagnosed head injuries, she acknowledged that it was a possibility. And now I want to tee this up by explaining how very early in the research about head injury Owen's case occurred. This is why Owen is important, because 10 years of research have followed. At the time, they were not 100% sure that his suicidal behavior, his depression, that there was a cause and effect between the level of CTE he had and that behavior. They are much more confident now that there's a cause and effect at the level that he had CTE. But going back to his mom's testimony, she nevertheless, as a mom, was really focused on the fact that her son, who never had any history of depression or anything of that nature, she was sure that it was a major contributing factor to his death, and she really urged them to look closely at how they could make the game safer for young men, and particularly children. She volunteered quickly that if they had any idea how dangerous it was for him to begin playing so young, they of course would not have permitted him to play.
Okay, so we have time for one more question. And let's see. Okay, what do people misunderstand? Sorry, Heather asks, what do people misunderstand about the process of writing a book?
What do they misunderstand? That it's easy. not to be flip, but it's a long and arduous process. And one of the things that they also don't understand, that I had to make that joke for all. I recognize the names of a number of writer friends in the crowd tonight by their names, and so I said that to make them all laugh, because it's not easy. But more than that, it's that that the book, that you do several versions of the book before you're done. That you don't write a draft and that's the draft that ends up being printed. I had probably, by the time I was done, between 4 and 5 drafts. I say between 4 and 5 because by the time I got to the last draft, there were things that didn't change. But even the draft that I, when Beacon Press kindly contracted with me to publish the book, the draft that I brought to the table at that point completely changed under the guidance of my great editor, Joanna Green. I feel like I have to give her a shout out, who had the same vision for the book that I did. So I was so blessed. But that it's not, it's not a once and done process. And I mean, the other thing is to talk about that last version. I've been exchanging text messages with different people who I interviewed for the book ever since it came out on September 1, telling them, I'm sorry, more of your interview wasn't in the book because it ended up on the cutting room floor, just like they say in the movies, because things change. Things change. It's a long process.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Vicki, and thank you, Keith, for a great conversation, and Vicki for just writing an amazing book. Everyone, if you want to check in the chat, there's a link where you can purchase Growing Up on the Gridiron. On that, thank you for coming. Thanks for coming to the event, and everyone have a great night.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for being here.